Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to Deep Thoughts. Today we're going to talk about one of my most coveted things I get to observe in this world, called Twilight Zone. Written mainly and created by Rod Serling. Not Rod Sterling, as some people call him. I'm going to use today a little reference guide here. This is a book called The Twilight Zone Companion, and it's the second edition by Mark Scott Zicree, Zicree. And it's just because I want to mention episodes and get the names right on the episodes, because I routinely find it difficult to distinguish the names between each other. So I review The Twilight Zone. Well, what's interesting about The Twilight Zone is that obviously the more generations we get away from the late 50s, early 60s, the people that know that it exists are fewer and fewer. The problem is that the value of the episodes go way, way beyond the basics. There's a new show on, well, it's not new. It's a couple of years old for Netflix, and it's about 5 years old for the BBC, and it's called Black Mirror. I believe the name Black Mirror refers to your television. When you look at it and it's off, it's a black mirror. A mirror referring to the metaphorical benefits you get from watching this show and that you see into yourself. If it's a good episode, you see into yourself. And Black Mirror is a brilliant, brilliant show. It is probably the very first time, in my personal opinion, that the Twilight Zone has ever been resurrected in a way that feels like it has a 21st century style to it, quality to it. The actors are fantastic. The writing's fantastic. And it has me thinking more about Twilight Zone. Now, what I do with Twilight Zone is I go through the 4 seasons that are on Netflix. There's actually a 4th season that's not on Netflix for some weird reason, and I'll tell you why in a sec here. But you can go through dozens and dozens of episodes, and they're all phenomenal, and they all tell you something about yourself, I should say, and society. Some of them are goofy fun, some are really serious, some are scary, just like Black Mirror's turning into. What's interesting about Twilight Zone is that you can't just recreate it. You have to have very gifted minds working together to create Twilight Zones / Black Mirrors. So they have tried to resurrect this show, God, I don't even know, 4 times at least. And I have not seen the last Americanized version, which I believe used the name Twilight Zone in it. But it never sticks because we don't truly produce the intellect in this world in any great number that matches the intellect of a gentleman that started writing this and creating it in the mid-50s. Finally getting his chance to air it in 1959. But the quality of the episodes, again, is really why you want to watch it. It'll make you sort of a historian of mankind. And not necessarily the historic realization of what happened in history at one point in time. There's several episodes that do, itemize the assassination of Lincoln, the several wars, several battle scenes inside the Civil War, World War II, etc. Now, Vietnam hadn't started yet. Otherwise, he would have written about it. Now, the guy Rod Serling, who put this together, he was just an extremely gifted dude. He had been celebrated quite a bit for his writing capabilities up till the point of starting the Twilight Zone. There was an amazing interview with him just before the show aired on TV, just like a Rod Serling interview in 1959. And the main thing that he wrote about in this show was, we'll get to that in a second. The main thing he commented about in this interview was that the networks were already starting to get infiltrated. By whom exactly, he didn't really say. But he said this whole thing was about pre-censorship in the 50s, and that he couldn't write certain episodes the way that they should be written because someone's going to come in and they'll say literally that, that soup can can't be there, or this isn't promoted enough, or the guy that's sponsoring the show doesn't want to hear anything about a certain subject because it competes with his own preferences or the ability to market his product. And so he said that what the networks were doing, I guess this was with Mike Wallace, September 22nd, 1959, he said that the networks were essentially going to be hiring people that believed the way that the network needed them to believe ahead of time, and that's what he referred to as pre-censorship. And that's a huge deal. That's how you get all these personalities on Fox News and CNN. They cannot think for themselves, but they're pretty people, and so they kind of puff up their chests like, well, of course I'm completely right. Look at me. Look how sexy I am. So what Rod was trying to do in the early to mid-50s was write very serious, on-point pieces for television. Hey, everybody, look here. Isn't this something that needs to be fixed? And the problem is the networks could immediately understand that that was what he was trying to do. And so they would simply cockblock him. And they were doing this to all kinds of other writers, which Rod was observing. So Rod said, I need something very abstract so that I can hide the themes and the lessons, which I think people need to learn, inside some fictional situation which the network executives and the sponsors will not catch, but that the people will. And then he invents this amazing hook at the end of every episode. Now, most of the Twilight Zones from season 1, 2, 3, and 5 are half an hour long, which means broadcast time and Netflix time is 22 minutes. They had figured out the 22-minute format on a level that was perfect. So they know exactly how long to hold you through each one of the sequences, the setup, all the suspenseful center sections, the kind of the traditional Act 2, and then the Act 3 payoff. But the Act 3 was always a twist, usually. Something you never thought was coming. And I will say to this day, they have rarely been emulated. But I'll tell you, Stephen King, the famous horror writer, I'm not sure how many books he has stolen straight out of Twilight Zones. And not every single Twilight Zone was written by the writers of the Twilight Zone in its original sense. Because if you look at the credits, it will say, teleplay based on story by, boom. Now here's something very interesting. So for those of you who are still wondering who Rod Serling is, of course you can look him up. He introduces most of the shows, and he wrote half of the shows. Now, Rod Serling, you have to understand, he was a very fit gentleman, but he wasn't very tall. I guess he's around 5'4". He went into the military. He became a paratrooper. They told him he was too small to be as embedded as he ended up being, and he kept just telling people, screw you, man. I'll make this work. And so when you see Rod Serling stand in front of a camera and introduce one of the episodes, when you listen to the dialogue that he's put together for these episodes, you have to understand he was a man's man. He was a brilliant writer. He understood sociology and psychology on a level that few of us ever will. And he understood it so much that he ran ahead and could look back. And when you can do that, you can write episodes that for television. You just can. Because he saw them, hey guys, I'm up here. I'm way ahead of you intellectually. He was never arrogant, but I'm just saying he was out there in terms of way ahead of us. And so he could write stories and send them back to us. It was really cool. He lived a very short life. He died at 50 due to being a chain smoker. There was another episodic thing he was involved with called Night Watch in the late 60s, early 70s. He had very little, if any, contribution to that on a writing level. He simply introduced the episodes and was not a huge fan of it. Now, there are tons of episodes that I think are just utterly brilliant. But some of them are more important than others in terms of the conversation related to deep thoughts, which for me is going to be something that advances your sociological or psychological perception of yourself. And some of them are just, little funny stories about doing deals with devils and that kind of stuff. One of the episodes that aired on October 30th, 1959, and yes, I'm using this book to figure out exactly when things are dated, but I'm not going to be reading any of the notes. I'm just going to give you my own opinion. But it's called Walking Distance, and it's about an executive that comes out of the big city and goes back to his hometown, and he's kind of excited to be there, and he knows that, the town's changed quite a bit since he's been there, because I guess it's been about 20 years. But he goes back, and he realizes, wow, the place looks pretty damn good. He goes to a little diner where he used to get a malt or like a shake or something, right? And he finds out that the same thing is there, the same selection's there. Doesn't quite recognize the guy behind the counter, but he tries to pay a normal price for it, and the price is really, really inexpensive, like a dime or something. And he's like, really? You're going to lose your shorts if you keep charging that much? And he goes, oh, remember so-and-so? Remember the guy that used to sleep in the back? Oh, it's too bad he died. The guy leaves the diner, and the guy who's behind the counter goes into the room, and the guy that he just said died, who used to fall asleep and snore in the back, is asleep and he's snoring. And very quickly you find out that he's actually gone back in time. He's gone back to a time when he actually lived in his hometown. And the interesting thing about that, and I don't know how much that happens today, but for those of us who grew up in Midwestern towns and ended up going to the big city, you do think about the town when you were young. Because my town is, just a little tiny, it's like downtown Disney, little Kansas town. I remember novelty stores and that kind of stuff downtown. So one thing he's doing is tapping into the fantasy of someone going back in time. But then he shows you, by this guy progressing and interacting with the past, that he ends up screwing it up a little bit, and even causing himself a permanent injury by finding himself in the past. And trying to help himself, he hurts himself. And the irony is that in time travel, you leave shit alone, and you realize that where you are today is where you're supposed to be. You're not supposed to go back in time. It's pretty interesting. Now, one of the cool things about Twilight Zones in general is that by 1959, when they started this series, the individuals that were participating in the show were at the peak of their abilities. The number of actors that they hired who were just killing every line, just blowing everyone away, was phenomenal. The directors, the set designers, the writers, every single human being that participated in a Twilight Zone did a grade A job. Out of seeing all of the episodes, which I believe is around 180 or so, maybe 190, something like that, you rarely have a single actress or actor who blows a line. They're all on target. And when they're on target, you start to, your suspension of disbelief is there. Now, one of the things that Rod was faced with was the atomic era, duck and cover, nuclear weapons are coming sort of thing, which we just did the episode on, right? So he and his writers were always writing about the threat of nuclear war, just to make sure that we play it out in our minds so that we understand that that's a ridiculous thing to consider. And he wrote about it in several different ways, and one of the first episodes is called Third from the Sun. It was aired in 1960, January 8th, written by Rod Serling. Again, based on a story called Third from the Sun by Richard Matheson. And it's about a factory that has two employees that work on aerospace. And they're coming home from work. And there's this really weird small talk conversation about meeting later at one of the scientists' homes. And very shortly you realize that that their world is facing a nuclear holocaust. And they have a special spaceship that they have been working on, a covert spaceship which has interplanetary capabilities, travel, but hasn't been tested properly. But these two scientists get the idea that they are going to pay off the guard, steal the ship, bring their family with them, and get the hell out of Dodge. And sure enough, that's what they do. But then there's a twist. One of the other amazing writers is Charles Beaumont. Charles Beaumont will have written several episodes that you will absolutely feel and love. His stuff is usually a lot more wispy and happy, but he also wrote some pretty strange stuff. Now, one of the most brilliant episodes written, and there's going to be several, but it's called Monsters Are Due on Maple Street. The Monsters Are Due on Maple Street. It all starts off with a beautiful neighborhood, which I think is in Universal Studios. And it's just a good panning shot of everyone having a good time, kids playing, people playing catch, guy washing his car, guy watering the lawn, guy mowing the lawn. The women are doing whatever they're doing, and it's just this beautiful little idealistic neighborhood. And then, just about the time everyone realizes everything just couldn't be any better, the power goes out. The phone goes out, which is obviously on a whole different power circuit, right? Vehicles won't start. Clocks start. Radios won't turn on that have batteries in them. Something's gone wrong. And so they all huddle together in the street, and they're like, the leader of the, group, he says, well, I'll walk downtown and I'll find out what's going on. I'll check to see. One guy leaves and he's like, hey, I'll find out if there's power on next door, the street over. And the old man leaves to check the street next door, but before this other guy can leave, a young boy who reads comic books says, don't leave. This is what they want you to do. Oh, it starts off with a sort of a UFO flying overhead. Some crazy unidentified object flies overhead, makes a bunch of noise, and everyone walks out and goes, ooh, what's that? And then the power goes off. Sorry, I'm screwing that up there. I'll slow down on the next explanation. But this little boy seeds everyone's mind with a comic book. And then the people on the street begin to slowly believe and usurp that story. But they go crazy because they start believing this story about how aliens want them to separate, and that they usually send agents that come first. And then they get suspicious that one of them is an agent, and then all of a sudden power goes on in one guy's area, and then they immediately accuse him of being a bad guy, and then power switches around. But the interesting thing, and there's 2 episodes almost identical, but this is the first one. And then, of course, there's a twist that teaches us not to lose our crap, to really think methodically and don't introduce fiction into our reality. And when you really think about how the press manipulates a popular opinion, this is, you replace monster with media. The media are due on Maple Street would be an equal methodology. If you ever wanted to know one of the bases of Planet of the Apes, watch an episode called I Shot an Arrow into the Air. It's based on an idea by Madeline Champion, and it's written by Rod Serling. But it's about 3 astronauts that go up into the sky and end up crash landing on a planet. Very similar twists. Now there's another episode here. Now the next one I want to talk about is called What You Need. This is another one written by Rod Serling. It's based on a short story called What You Need by Louis Paget. But it's about an old man who has one of those little knick-knack suitcases and a little kickstand. You can set them up outside of a place and you can sell anything from bubble gum to shoelaces, all that kind of stuff. But this guy has a gift. He knows what you need before you need it. And it's never anything that you would think that you would need. Which the beauty of that whole turn in that story, that premise, is that's usually how life works, right? Advertising tells us what we need, but we don't really need it. We get ideas in our minds about what we need, and what we need is actually very, very little. But he repairs people's lives by giving them this weird thing, and then you get to see how it plays out in the next 5 to 10 minutes of their life. Now, the twist with this story, the first twist of the story, is that there's kind of a jerk off sitting at the bar who notices that this thing happens 3 or 4 times in the room. And he's like, oh my God, you have this ability to tell people what they need. What do I need? And he doesn't want to do business with the guy. He says, I'm closed. I'm done for the night. He's all, no, you're not getting away that much, that quickly. And he roughs him up. He sneaks into his house. He keeps forcing him to give him stuff. And it has a really amazing twist at the end, but it really talks about people and the shortcuts they try to engage in life to get ahead. Because like I said, that shit doesn't work very often. At all. Now, I'm skipping episodes that are just utterly amazing, but they don't have, the huge impact to your soul like other ones do. They're just really entertaining. The next one on the list is called A Stop at Willoughby. There's an ad executive who works in New York City. I believe that's his job. And this is, again, written by Rod Serling. But it has to do with the fact that he's working for this high-pressure ad agency with this absolute bully of an old man who runs a place. And his mantra is push, 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 push. You're supposed to take yourself to the next level. Never, never, ever relax and smell the flowers. Never relax and live life. Just push, 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 as some neurotic douchebag who runs a place says. And he is attempting, he has successfully actually become obviously a really celebrated executive, but there was a problem. He lost an account right towards the beginning of the episode, and it was due to some problem where he allowed a rookie to take the account, and then the rookie left and went to a competitor and took the account with him. So he lost a huge account. But every day this guy goes home from work, he has to ride the train, which I guess might be the subway, might be a train, not sure. And while he's on the train, he falls asleep, and then he wakes up, and he's on an old train 100 years earlier in the 1860s, and there's a guy asking for tickets, guy saying, next stop Willoughby, which is kind of cool because I'm a Willoughby. But he never gets off for the first part of the film. Now, in the end, he gets off at the end. That's sort of the twist at the end, but you kind of see this coming. But the big, giant moral of this particular story was Rod was writing about how we had converted out of sovereign jobs, really, where we ran the show. Like I always say, 150 years ago, everyone worked for themselves. Not completely true, but I think the majority of humans did. And when they started finding it hard to generate money, the corporations moved in, railroads, big industry, that kind of thing, and you learned how to work for someone else. And then corporatism came in, and the tech revolution, all this kind of stuff. But this is written before the tech revolution, really. But it's sort of like a caution. If you're going to work for someone else, it needs to be a decent environment. It needs to be a decent situation. You have to have balance between yourself and your work. This next one is actually almost like, after you see all the Twilight Zones, this one almost feels like it's made in a different era. It's uniquely written by a guy named Robert Presnell Jr., who I've never really seen write 2 episodes. But it's called The Chaser. It's based on a short story by John Collier. I want to call these folks out because they deserve everything. But you have to understand, if I were to really give you the credits I think that people need, I'd have to read the whole cast and the whole crew. But this is about a guy who has an absolute crush on this gorgeous woman, but she doesn't really have the time of day for him. She's kind of played off like a materialistic girl. And so he ends up complaining publicly, and someone says, gives him a card, and he says, this is the guy you need to talk to. If you're trying to get the love of a woman, this is who you need to talk to. He'll solve your problem. So sure enough, he goes to this guy, and there's a library, big giant library, but sort of like a kooky, single guy's gigantic library. And he says, I've been sent here because I heard you could solve my problem. And he essentially gives him an elixir. Doesn't cost that much at all, about $10. He goes, yeah. He goes, this is the elixir. And he goes, you get her to drink this, and the first man she sees after she drinks this, she will be totally and completely in love with and devoted. And so he goes off, he buys this, and he can't even believe how he can't believe it'll work. He can't believe it costs nothing, right? And the guy warns him, he says, well, the antidote to this will cost you something, will cost you a lot of money. So brace for that. He's like, oh, I won't need an antidote. He says, yeah, that's what they all say. The guy runs off and buys 2 little bottles of champagne, brings a couple glasses, brings this elixir, begs her just to have one final drink with him, and then she'll never have to see him again, which is kind of what she wants. She goes with it. And true to his word, the elixir completely transforms this woman, and she is head over heels for this guy on a level that is like, wow. And again, the actress who plays this just absolutely blows you away. She just absolutely transforms. I can't believe this hasn't turned into a film, quite frankly. But then they flash forward a few weeks, and she is absolutely just annoying the crap out of him. There's nothing she won't do for him. And he wants her to stop doing this. So he goes off and tries to buy the antidote to the elixir. You can watch the rest of that. It's called The Chaser. I'll try to say the name of the episode at the beginning and at the end. Okay, this one I'm just going to mention really quickly because it has to do with something that happens when you write. And this one is very famous and is the only time you will see Rod involved in a script. This is called A World of His Own. It's written by Richard Matheson, and it's about a writer who's got this wife, and she's sort of a high-maintenance wife, but he has sent her off to go see the movies, and he has another woman in his study, this blonde, sort of non-assuming woman named Mary. She's mixing him a cocktail, and they're just enjoying themselves until his wife comes home early from the movie, looks through the window, and then comes around the corner demanding to come inside. By the time she comes inside, the woman's gone. And she's like, where did you hide her? He's like, who are you talking about? What are you talking about? She said, you must have a trap door in this joint. They know I don't have any trap door. Look around all you want. But she pressures him to the point that he admits that what he does is he dictates into a little reel-to-reel recorder, sort of a dictaphone of the past. And the irony about this, or the coincidence about this, is that that's how Rod Serling wrote all his episodes. Was sitting in a pool, or sitting by a pool, sitting in his study, and he reads off the whole thing into a dictaphone recorder with reel-to-reel, tiny little reel-to-reels, and his assistant would transcribe everything into text form. Brilliant. I only wish I was that good. But what he says is, he goes, look, when I told you that I wrote characters and they start living on their own, they start arguing with me. He says, the more I describe them into this recorder, and the more accurate I describe them, they show up. They actually show up living and breathing. And the woman that you saw was just one of my characters that I call up every once in a while to keep me company. And she doesn't believe it, of course. And she says, oh, I see what you're trying to do. You're trying to claim insanity so you can get out of, paying me what you owe me if we get a divorce or something like that. But I'm going to divorce you and I'm going to have you committed. And that's sort of the setup. At the very end, Rod Serling actually doesn't just narrate something at the end, because he never comes back on camera. The format is he's on camera, narrates, if he's even doing that, which is the majority of the episodes. But at the end, he's actually in the episode. And so A World of His Own is actually very unique in that sense. And there was actually an homage to that at Disneyland with the Tower of Terror, which is devoted to Twilight Zone. By the time season 1 was over, Rod Serling won his 4th Emmy. Now, one of the most famous episodes that you will see in visual form is called The Eye of the Beholder. It was aired on November 11th, 1960, written by Rod Serling. It has to do with a very interesting episode where you do not get to see anyone's face until the very last twist. But someone has had some massive plastic surgery on their face, and the concern with all the help at the hospital and of the patient is this particular surgery going to work? Is it going to fix the way I look? Am I going to be horrendously disfigured my whole life? And they just basically say, we don't know. We're gonna take off your bandages here in a little while. We'll find out. I won't ruin the twist for you. But it is truly the eye of the beholder is really the twist's entire fabric at the end there. For those of you who are William Shatner fans, he has been in 2 different episodes. And one of them is Next of Time, and I believe the other one is like Monster on the Wing or something like that. They're not really worth just describing in terms of their moral uptick or anything like that. They're just really good, great episodes with really nice twists. Nick of Time. Did I just say that wrong? It's Nick of Time. Is a very slow-moving, fun episode. And The Monster on the Wing, which I'll correct if I got that wrong, is a very high-energy, crazy, scary episode. Now, there's an episode I want to mention because I think it was the basis of a movie that was made in the 80s called The Keep. But this one's called The Howling Man. It's written by Charles Beaumont, based on a story by Charles Beaumont. But it has to do with a traveler who's traveling in the middle of the night. It's raining outside. It's torrentially raining outside, and he ends up finding a castle. And he just knocks on the door, which because there's lights on it, and he finds out there's like a monastery full of monks in there, and they're like, "You can't stay here. This is not a place for people to spend the night." He's like, "Come on, you're holy men. I'll die if I stay out here. I'll drown." And they're like, "Okay, well, let me talk. You got to talk to the guy in charge." And then the guy in charge says, No, you can't stay here. This is not a place for lodging." But every few minutes he's in this place, there's this horrendous howl, like a werewolf-y kind of howl going on. And no one seems to acknowledge it. And he's kind of like, don't you hear that? And they all kind of look at him, like, we're not supposed to talk about it. But it turns out that inside this place is the devil. But he's claiming not to be the devil. I shouldn't tell you that much, but still, you got to see the episode because it won't change a damn thing. But The Keep is a movie pretty much based off the entire theme of The Howling Man. Oh, yes. This episode I just want to mention because I think it has to do with at least 2 books of Stephen King, Christine and Maximum Overdrive. This episode is called A Thing About Machines, and it was aired in October 28th, 1960. It's about a man who hates all technology, and it doesn't like him either. All I'm going to say is that eventually all of the machines in his house rebel against him, which is the Maximum Overdrive storyline that Stephen King took. And then the other one is his car drives itself at night and terrorizes him, which is the Christine twist. Now, there's another episode all about Christine, which I'll mention when we get to it, right? Now, this other one is very interesting. It's called A Penny for Your Thoughts, and it's written by George Clayton Johnson, excuse me. It actually stars Dick York. This one's about a guy that is going to work one morning, and he buys a newspaper, and he flips his quarter into the tray to pay for the newspaper. But the quarter stands up on its end, literally on its edge. It's a very miraculous thing that happens, and because he did that, he activated the Twilight Zone. And all of a sudden, he could hear everyone's thoughts. And he starts having a really crazy day. And he's a bank manager. He's a loan manager at a bank, and he starts to hear all these shenanigans going on at the bank, including a guy that wants to borrow money to go to Vegas and bet on it, bet with that money. The cool twist at the end of this, which I'm not going to tell you what happens in the episode itself, but you really do find out that having sovereign thought and not hearing everyone else's thoughts are probably a really good idea. But it's called A Penny for Your Thoughts and is really endearing, sweet little episode. Okay, so this next one is one of my favorite ones of all time. It might be literally my favorite episode of all the Twilight Zones, and believe me, that's tough saying that. But this is called The Trouble with Templeton. It's written by E. Jack Newman, and it's about a sort of an older actor. He's in his twilight years of his career. He used to be super famous, but now he's going to be doing sort of a stage play with a young director. And he shows up to work a little bit late. He gets chewed out. And what you learn sort of from his backstory, he's got a new wife, and the new wife is cheating on him already with the pool boy. But he just kind of realizes this is what's going to happen. I'm an old man. If I'm going to date a young girl, she's got to have companions that can, I guess, satiate her physically or something. Really kind of edgy script. It aired in December 9th, 1960. But he goes to this place, and he realizes he's much bigger than what he's doing, and it just drives him crazy. Because of his age, he's being marginalized. So at some point in the meeting with this young crew, getting chewed out a little bit, he leaves the theater, just a backstage rehearsal area. And when he goes outside, he teleports back to his younger era when he used to have this wife, a wife who died, I guess. And he it takes him a while to realize he's gone back in time. The posters on the walls are of plays that he's done and a bunch of stuff. Like he isn't young physically, but he goes down to his speakeasy because he hears that his ex-fiance, his fiance that died, is in there, and he's like, "Oh my God, I get to see my love of my life." And he goes inside this speakeasy, and it is just rip roaring. Charleston playing, you have a bunch of booze, and sure enough, his love of his life is in there with one of his best friends. And I guess his best friend was dead by the time this episode started. But he tries to get I guess it's his fiance or his girlfriend or whatever it is, to go with him. Let's leave. Let's get out of here. Let's go do something. And they look at him and they see him old and they say, buddy, take your makeup off. What the hell's the deal here? They call him Boothie is his name, right? And eventually he's an older man and she's really young and she's drunk and she's dancing and she's acting a fool, and he keeps trying to tell her, look, this is a unique moment. We got to get out of here right now. I don't know how long this is going to last. And she ends up being really ornery with him. And he's sort of like, he's so much different that he's no longer compatible with her anymore. And she I'll tell you a little bit of this ending. The brilliance of this is that he stomps out of the speakeasy because he's so pissed off. And he's like, what's wrong with you? God damn it, And as soon as he leaves and the door closes, the music ends. And his girlfriend walks into the light looking in his direction. And you can tell her heart's broken. And what happened is that she gave him the gift that he needed, which is to forget about his past, to let her go in his mind, to realize that they're different people now. Probably not really in the afterlife, but in his mind, he needs to understand, he needs to move on. But while he was at the table, he grabs a piece of paper and he kind of shakes it in someone's face at the speakeasy, and then he leaves and he comes back to this rehearsal, sort of a new man a little bit. And he realizes as he's walking in the room, before anyone notices him, he's got that piece of paper in his pocket. And he pulls it out and he reads, and it's the script of everything his girlfriend said to him at the speakeasy, or everything his buddy said to him at the speakeasy. And he realizes it was a gift, that it was all rehearsed, it was planned. And the emotional turn, like when you see the girlfriend walk up after he leaves, if you don't feel something, you didn't get the episode. For those of you who like Blade Runner, the movie, you need to see The Lateness of the Hour, written by Rod Serling. That's all I'm going to say about that particular one. Okay, so the other one that Rod Serling wrote, called The Whole Truth, is where Stephen King gets another part of his Christine arc. It's also the episode that Liar Liar was based on, with Jim Carrey. Something that activates the truth serum that can't be turned off until something else happens. Another good kind of moral episode is called the Rip Van Winkle Caper. It's about four guys who rob a bunch of gold bars out of some bank or some institution, and their plan is to hibernate in a cave until everything blows over. So they're going to hibernate for 100 years, and then when they wake up, they figure they can take the gold and sell it, and no one will notice. And so they go in and they hibernate. They wake up and they realize not all of them made it. A rock fell on one of the dude's hibernation chambers, and he didn't make it. But what this one does, without telling you much of the rest of the story, is that it shows you that when you have a greedy heart, if you don't fix that greedy heart, you will end up suffering from it no matter what. You will. You will demise. And these guys waited 100 years, did not fix their greedy hearts, and they have problems. It's called The Rip Van Winkle Caper, and it was written by Rod Serling. Okay, any of you who like Groundhog Day? The episode in Twilight Zone that Groundhog Day was based on was called Shadow Play. It was written by Charles Beaumont. This is better than Groundhog Day. Much better, because every time this guy wakes up and has to live his life, which is all I'm going to tell you, the people switch places. It has been later usurped by the Dark City and probably Westworld. Another great episode I always mention called The Mind and the Matter. I actually have misquoted it calling Mind Over Matter, but it's called The Mind and the Matter. It's about a gentleman who's a sociopath who thinks that the world shouldn't have any people because he can't get along with them. It's another Rod Serling script. Brilliant twist. And he gets into the beatnik phenomenon of people reading Mind Over Matter books back in the day. For those of you who don't know, it was a big deal back then. The Obsolete Man. The Obsolete Man is just brilliant. It's a Rod Serling creation. It has Burgess Meredith in it, which is probably one of the best actors to ever be in it. Every Burgess Meredith Twilight Zone is one of the best Twilight Zones you can ever watch, just so you know. It just really calls out to what would be the world in a tyrannical place where the government is telling you how to believe, how to think, what is valuable, what isn't valuable. It's this world if we don't get control over it. So watch The Obsolete Man. And that was the end of season 2. Now, just real quickly, there's one called The Grave. And it was written and directed by Montgomery Pittman, which is very unique. But it has to do with a cowboy that has been in search of a bad guy who's been paid to actually go kill a bad guy for a town, and he ends up failing to find him, even though he chased him all over creation. He comes back to the hometown, and they tell him, well, he came back here and he died. He's buried out there in the graveyard. And then he gets to talking to these guys at the saloon, which are made out of a bunch of sort of wimpy guys, but they're all very interesting people. But they craft a bet, and they say, you know what, we bet you didn't even go look for him, because that's what he said. He said you didn't even look for him. And because we don't believe that you looked for him, you're going to have to prove that you have the guts to go and do something. And they have this idea that he's supposed to go up to the grave at midnight and put a dagger into the soil. And then they'll all go look at it during the day and prove that he has the guts and he's not afraid of this guy. Well, there's a twist. But in the end, it has to do with if your imagination gets out of hand, you can cause yourself a lot of problems. It's a Good Life. It's a Good Life. Another one of written by Rod Serling, based on a short story by Jeremy Bixby. It's about a little boy that gains an ultimate power to make anything happen he wants. And he ends up pretty much destroying the world and torturing his family and the closest friends. And I think it's really one of these sort of Willy Wonka turns where you have, if you don't discipline children, what they would do to the world with their infantile minds, would be to do what is not good for them. So you have to parent your children. This kid, unfortunately, gets out of control before they can stop him. The Shelter. The Shelter is a huge episode about a bunch of people that I mentioned this several times on the show, but The Shelter is about a community of people in a little town. It's really on that street where the other one happens, where the power goes off and on. But they're all having a dinner together, and they're celebrating one of the local doctors on the street. And then they make fun of the fact that he's built this shelter underneath his house. And everyone had to listen to him building this thing. And then his son rushes into the room and says there's a warning, a bulletin on the radio that seems pretty bad. And they turn the radio on, and they find out that there's this nuclear war that's about to start. Everyone get to a shelter. So everyone realizes that they don't have one. They didn't prepare, and they all went in his shelter. But he only built a shelter to house his wife, himself, and his child, his son. And he can't let them in. But they all go batshit. They go crazy. They start to accuse each other of all kinds of things, trying to say how one person's better than another, how one person deserves to be in the shelter. And they go crazy. And then there's a twist at the end. It's a really intense moral story. Very intense. The Quality of Mercy. It's written by Rod Serling, based on a story by Sam Rolfe, and is very, very important. You have I think Leonard Nimoy's in this one too. Yeah. It's a story about a bunch of soldiers who are in, I forgot what war it was, probably the Korean War or something like that, but or Japanese War, could be World War II. The Philippine Islands, that's what it is. So they're fighting their enemy, which is a group of Asian guys fighting on the other side, and they sort of have each other kind of spent. And this young whippersnapper officer shows up who's never been in war and says, I want you to go over there and kill them all. And his commanding officer, his NCOs are kind of going, Captain, they're spent, we're spent. Let's just let them escape in the middle of the night. We don't need any more bloodshed. The guy's like, that's not the way war works. Da-da-da-da. And he goes, oh, yeah, what would you know about war? And within a split second, this guy blinks his eyes and finds out that he is a white guy, and they've done makeup on him to make him Asian. And he wakes up as a member of the other camp on the other side. And that the commanding officer on that side, the Japanese or whatever it is, says, I want you to kill all these Americans on the other side. And he realizes the futility of what he was saying by being put on the other side and seeing it from both sides. It's called a quality of mercy. For those of you like Spock, he's in there. The other one I want to talk about is The Hunt. The Hunt is about an old man who has a dog, hunting dog. He's got his wife. Comes home and he wants to hunt the next day. And he's going to hunt raccoons or something like that. Or hunting something. And they end up both dying. His dog falls in the water chasing something. He goes in after him, and they both die. And they wake up, and they're trying to find what to do next. They're not quite sure what happens. They have to kind of figure out that they're dead. The old man sees his funeral and that kind of stuff. And then he gets essentially wooed by what he thinks is heaven. And he finds out that he almost goes to hell. But it's a very interesting twist on how we perceive heaven and hell. I know I'm losing my light, but I'm just going to keep going here. Another interesting one is The Mirror. And The Mirror's got Peter Falk. So anyone of you know Peter Falk, he's a very famous guy all the way through his entire career. He was the grandfather who read the book in Princess Bride, just for those of you who don't remember. He also played a detective. But this is a story about him playing Fidel Castro. They don't really call him Castro, but that's who he is in this. And it's just about the insanity that comes on when you become the man in charge. And so it shows the paranoia that grows over time. And he starts to see things in mirrors. It speeds up the process quite a bit. So it's called The Mirror. One of the episodes I want to tell you is called Once Upon a Time. The real special thing about Once Upon a Time is not the story. It's a really cute story. But it has a silent movie actor who is utterly famous beyond belief for what he did. Charlie Chaplin went first, and this guy named Buster Keaton went second. And Buster Keaton is in this as an older man, and he speaks. And Buster Keaton was just an utter genius. He was an improvisational genius, just like Charlie Chaplin. He did all of his own stunts. So when you see him in this episode, he's a very special gentleman. One more pallbearer, written by Rod Serling, is about a guy who becomes a multimillionaire, and he tries to get revenge on a school teacher, a preacher, and a commander in the military by bringing them down into a bunker that has been rigged to simulate a nuclear holocaust going on outside, and he wants them to beg for mercy to stay in his shelter. But then there's a twist of how they interpret the whole thing. And he has so miscalculated things by becoming a sociopath, he can't predict how they would react and why they would react that way. Another one is called A Piano in the House, which has a very similar arc as One More Pallbearer, but this one's written by Earl Hammer Jr. And Earl Hammer, his stuff is just really unique and fun. But it's about a guy who finds a player piano that when he plays a player piano piece, if it happens to match your character, it will bring out a quality in your character that you have been hiding. And so everyone else gets to see this sort of internal personality that you have that is very revealing to your character. So if you had a love for someone, you would start talking about it, etc. Very brilliant. That one's called A Piano in the House. This one I'm just going to mention because it's really fun. It's called Showdown with Rance McGrew. It's about a kind of a foo-foo cowboy actor in the 50s/60s who is, he's one of these fake characters that never existed, and they write script after script where he is essentially kicking everyone's ass from the 1800s, right? Because it's all set in the 1800s, and so he's beating up Jesse James and all these other guys, and eventually Jesse James comes to visit him and says, we've been watching you from the spirit realm, and we don't like what you're doing here. So you and I are going to have a showdown. You can show me how badass you are. And, of course, the guy's a total wuss. And so they fix the problem in a very creative way when he goes back. It's called The Showdown with Rance McGrew. Brilliant episode. So one of these is actually, I think, one of the genesis of Blade Runner. It's called I Sing the Body Electric. And for years I thought that Philip K. Dick wrote this, but it's actually written by Ray Bradbury. It's about a group of kids being raised by their father, and their mother died. And the father doesn't know how to really handle it because, guys back in the day weren't the slightest bit right brain. And so they go to a service where they're actually able to design a mother / kind of Mary Poppins woman who raises them. And at first they reject her, and then through a very interesting twist, the one kid that won't accept her ends up totally accepting her. But it has to do with memory tracks and a bunch of other stuff, which ended up becoming what made the robots in Blade Runner really amazing. So it's called I Sing the Body Electric. Now, for those of you who have, Rick Gervais's movie, Invention of a Lie or something like that, that one is based off of, this particular episode has two movies that have been taken from it. This one's called Hocus Pocus and Frisbee. And it's about an old man who runs a sort of like convenience store, hardware store, kind of all-purpose store in this little town, and he tells super tall tales. And everyone just loves going there. This is written by Rod Serling based on Frederick Lewis Fox's story. So the couple things that happen in this is that he's telling lies, and he's being watched by a couple aliens who are picking up specimens off each planet and trying to pick the very best specimens off these planets. And they figure this guy is lied about, he said he's got 32 degrees, he invented all this stuff, and they are an alien race that have never heard a lie before. They don't understand lies. They've been able to build their whole society and their interstellar spaceships without lies. Very interesting. So that's where Invention of a Lie comes from, is this episode. But the other thing they have is the big twist in Mars Attack by Tim Burton, where at the very end of that episode, they play music to kill the aliens. And Frisbee plays a harmonica and kills the aliens. Doesn't kill them, but he maybe kills them. Shit, I don't know. But they fall down and he escapes. But just so you know, Hocus Pocus and Frisbee is responsible for 2 movies. Little Girl Lost. We talked about this a while back. This one's written by Richard Matheson, based on a story by Richard Matheson. It is it's where Poltergeist came from. That's all I got to tell you. When you watch this, and you go, if you were to watch the 1982 Poltergeist, and then watch this episode, you'll be blown away how similar they are. All right, I just turned the light on to hopefully help out here. Can you imagine anyone? I don't know any of the podcast people. I don't know anyone who comments from the podcast. So for those of you who are like, we don't give a shit about your late, I apologize. For those of you who dig Carol Burnett, she was in a episode that was very interesting called Cavender is Coming. And it has to do with her getting a guardian angel to give her everything that she wants, but she doesn't want anything more than what she has. It's very interesting. Cavender is Coming with a C. Now, this next episode is actually one of my other favorites. It's called The Changing of the Guard, and it starts off very subtle. You'll like this more the older that you are. You won't like it as much when you're younger. But it has to do with a professor that has essentially finished his entire career at the college, and they are asking him to retire to make room for another young professor to come in and teach. And he sort of gets to the end of the whole thing, and he thinks, geez, was my life remotely valuable? Was I valuable to other people? And he gets to the point where he gets suicidal. This is another one written by Rod. But just as he gets to a point where he is about to essentially pull the trigger, the classroom that he is in, which is empty and really late at night, fills up with a bunch of students. And he's looking around the room going, where did you guys come from? And he starts recognizing them, and they start standing up one by one and telling him how they touched his life. And every single one of them in that room left his class, used his teachings to become heroes, to become great people, and then in some way, shape, or form, perished. And they came to visit him, and they all read off how they were affected by him, and by the end, he realizes he did make a difference. He just didn't always get the receipt for how he did such a thing, but it's called The Changing of the Guard. And there's actually a quote on a stone, which I will not attempt to butcher, but the quote on the stone that he reads is something that everyone needs to be able to hear at least once. I think the very next episode that aired was called The Trade-Ins, written by Rod Serling. An elderly couple is struggling with the fact that the man is terminally ill, but in this futuristic world, they can trade in their bodies, and they can get their consciousness put in another body, and they can be young again. So they go down and shop for it, thinking they can buy 2 of them, and when they hear the price, they can only afford 1. And so the wife beckons him on to do it. She's like, look, you're going to die. I don't want you to die. So he gets a new body. And then he suddenly realizes that his wife is still old. And instead of, there's a little bit of suspension disbelief because he could obviously get a job and earn $10,000 and get her a body before she dies. But he realizes that, escaping the notion of getting old and dying is sort of a fool's errand. You should just simply live your life as you are, not trying to go into some transhumanism savior mechanism before you die. And that's a big thing with my writing buddies in Hollywood right now. I feel like the world is, a bunch of plastic surgery and everything. You're just not supposed to get old. And I haven't done it technically. So, but, most of my friends are older, and they tell me it's a hell of a thing to get older. Okay, so season 4, things changed. It went from a half-hour format to a 1-hour format because everyone loved it so much. But the writers struggled with keeping the formula and the arc of suspense and the turns going. And they never mastered it to any degree. But one of the episodes in season 4 that I'm not sure how you get it besides purchasing it online or buying the DVD, but it's called The Printer's Devil. And I told you that any episode that Burgess Meredith is in is the one you have to watch. This is I guess it's probably 48-minute one. It's written by Charles Beaumont, based on a story by Charles Beaumont, but it is utterly brilliant. It has to do with a man that runs a newspaper in a little town, and a big newspaper moves in. They're just wiping them off the map. They can get the issues out faster. There's more news. There's syndicated circuits that they don't have, etc. The guy who owns the little newspapers, he's in debt. He can't pay off his bills. His printer quits and goes to work for the other guy because he hasn't been paid in weeks and weeks and weeks. So the guy that owns the paper goes to a local bridge, which doesn't look the slightest bit life-threatening, but he is going to jump off the bridge and commit suicide. And just about the time he jumps, Burgess Meredith walks up with this riddled cigar. It looks like a branch. And he says, "What you doing there?" And I'm not doing anything. And very quickly they have a conversation, and Burgess Meredith says, "Look, I'm looking to work at a newspaper. I'm a brilliant typist, or print typist, where you put the little letters together to be printed, and I'm not a bad reporter either." And very quickly he takes him back down, and he goes, "Okay, I'm going to give you a test. I'm going to read off something to you, and you do the typesetting for it, and we'll see how well you do." And faster than anyone he's ever seen in his life, Burgess Meredith just kills it. He puts together the paragraph. And very quickly, the newspaper starts doing really well. The news starts coming in. And one of the first things that happens is the other newspaper burns to the ground. And they have the paper out really, really quickly because Burgess, his character, whose name is Mr. Smith, starts to just knock everything out. But eventually the stories get so good and they're out so quickly that the guy who owns the place is like, how are you doing this? How do you seem to have the drop on all the news the second it happens and you got the paper ready and out for sale? And they're making gobs of money. But he starts to realize that maybe this guy is not what he thinks, not what he said he was in full. So for some of you who've seen the Tom Hanks movie, The Toy, or whatever it is, there's a great episode in the 1 hour sequence called The Incredible World of Horace Ford. It's written by a gentleman named Reginald Rose, and it is masterfully played. It's an older gentleman who never quite grew up, but he's the most amazing toy designer ever because he never grew up. But the shirts, the white collar shirt, people who run the factory are having a hard time keeping up with him. He's designing what kids want, but he can't convince them to do so. And so what starts happening is that the reason why he couldn't grow up is rooted in his past. And every time he goes home, he ends up going back to a street that was his past, and the street is actually in his past. And he starts seeing the little kids that he used to hang out with. And he has told a fictional story about his past to make his future tolerable. And over the course of the episode, he undoes this sort of misunderstanding about his past. And in the end, he ends up growing up in a really cool way. It's called The Incredible World of Horace Ford and is in the 1 hour episode section. This next episode is called The Passage of Lady Anne. And I think it has a really good value. It's written by Charles Beaumont based on one of his short stories. And it's about a couple that wants to go on a trip overseas to London. And the woman demands that they actually don't fly, that they use a boat to get across. Which in this later years of the 1963, boats aren't the way people travel. So the only thing that goes overseas is really either a cruise liner or a cargo ship. And they end up finding one of the oldest cruise line ships ever, and they buy 2 tickets, and they show up to get on the boat, and all these old people are getting on, all these amazing actors, by the way. And the old folks they're like really confused. What are you doing here? And they're like, well, we're going to ride the boat over. They're like, no, you can't go on this boat. Look, I'll buy your tickets off of you, and I'll even add more money to it to make sure that you can find a flight or a different boat. But they refuse. They're like, no, this is us. We can't afford. And she's worried that because the couple's actually kind of at odds with each other and they need some time together. And they're trying to repair their relationship by taking a cruise. Well, the brilliant part about this particular episode is that by being on the boat with these older couples that have already lived their lives and they've already traversed everything that could happen in terms of arguments between the two of them, what's important and what's not, they get educated by these other couples. And they end up fixing their relationship. But in the end, they keep saying, you got to get off this boat. Because the boat, we're not quite sure what happens, but they finally cave in. They're like, okay, we trust you. We're supposed to not be on this boat. And it looks like, I believe it looked like to me that the boat was supposed to disappear into the Twilight Zone or sink or something. This was going to be the end voyage, and all these people were going to die on this boat that they spent their entire lives cruising as young couples. And that was called The Passage of the Lady Anne being the boat. And again, the next episode aired is one I want to talk about called Of Late I Think of Cliffordville. This one's it's written by Rod Serling based on a story by Malcolm Jameson. But it's about a guy who's sort of a very successful businessman, and he sort of wants to go back and do it all again. And so he makes a deal with the devil, quite literally at the front, a female devil. And he's like, I know you're the devil, and I know you're going to try to screw me. So we're going to make very careful terms. And he's a businessman, so he thinks he can work a deal and stick it to the devil. I won't tell you how she sticks it to him, but she does. But he goes back, and with all these inventions, and the problem is he goes back too far. And all these things he wants to invent. He knows where a bunch of oil is in the ground, but they find out that the drills don't go down that far. so he can't get to it. He's going to have to wait years and years to get there. Now, he's a young man, so he figures he can make it. But there's a twist about how the devil screws him that makes that impossible. And so he makes a concession. There's like two twists. There's the twist of how she screwed him, and then there's the concession he makes to get back to the future. And there's just a really cool twist. And again, that one's called Of Late, I Think of Cliffordville. And it's, again, in the 4th season, which you will not be able to get on Netflix. This next episode is called On Thursday We Leave for Home. And again, I'm not reading all the episodes. I'm reading the ones that I think have really cool turns for you. This is, again, one of the 1-hour episodes. On Thursday We Leave for Home is about a group of colonists that get stranded on a planet far away. And they've sort of built their own culture. It's sort of related to my politics episode of how, naturally someone becomes the leader. And it's one of the older guys that is a good guy. He loves his people. He keeps them all in check. And they are so young that they don't know what Earth looks like. They've never been there because they're the next generation that was born. So they have him tell them stories about Earth and that, what have you. And then the rescue crew comes to take them all away. And this old man sort of gains this purpose by taking care of his people. But then when he finds out that when they get back to Earth, they don't plan on staying with him. He thinks that they're going to go back together and live in a colony together on Earth, together. And when he finds out that a lot of them are old enough to know what Earth looked like, they don't want to be with him. And he deals with his psychosis. It's very interesting. Something we need to look at ourselves with. And that's the end of season 4. Now the next one is in season 5, and it's called The Old Man in the Cave, written by Rod Serling, based on a story by Henry Slazar. This is about a post-apocalyptic era of humanity after nuclear war. There's a group of people living in a town just barely hanging on for life. There's a guy who's sort of in charge, but he is actually taking advice from something he calls the old man who lives in the cave. And this sort of military regiment shows up with 4 guys on a jeep. They've got guns, and for some reason this town doesn't have any guns. And they start bossing him around and saying, "You're going to do what we say." And he goes, and they have this big pile of food that they wanted to eat at the beginning, and the guy comes back from the cave and he says, "Don't eat it, it's all toxic." And they're all like, "Damn." And he goes, "Look, we have to trust the old man in the cave because he's never been wrong yet. And we're just going to have to survive off what we have." But when this new group comes up, this guy doesn't accept that there's an old man in the cave. And he says, let's eat this food. And he's like, no, we can't eat this food because the old man in the cave said it's bad. And he goes, "Who's this old man in the cave?" And he says, he just is. He's just an old man in the cave. And he tells us what's good and what's bad. So this group of soldiers say, "Well, you got to take us to this man in the cave." So he takes them to this door in the side of a cave. And they shoot it and they throw a grenade at it, and this door doesn't budge. Whoever's in there has got themselves protected. So finally they strong-arm the guy to open the door to the cave. And that's where the twist begins. But what it turns out to be is that when you're really cavalier with logic, you can get yourself in some serious issues. And that's the old man in the cave. Oh, just for the record, most of you probably knew this if you're familiar with Twilight Zone, but the one that William Shatner was in that was a little more high energy in season 5 is called Nightmare at 20,000 Feet, not Monster on the Wing. Now I'm going to skip around chronologically because I want to end on a particular episode because I think it's very profound based on our show especially. But the next one I'm going to talk about is called From Agnes with Love. And it is a completely endearing episode about, it's written by a guy named Bernard Schoenfeld, something like that. I think during season 5, people were peeling off, getting their next job because the show was about to end. But this is about an artificial intelligence that essentially gains full sentient life and falls in love with any programmer that shows her attention. And it's really, that's about it, but it's one of the cutest, probably most entertaining episodes they've created. So that's one I'll just throw out there. Before the HAL 9000 existed and went the dark route, this one went the light route, and it's really cool. Brilliant actors in there. Okay, so the last one I want to end on is one that I've actually posted on a couple different Facebook pages because I think it's pretty profound. It's called Number 12 Looks Just Like You. The teleplay was by John Tomerlin, and it was based off of a story by Charles Beaumont. But this is about a near future world where after a certain age, you are to replace your body using the tech from the couple that was replacing their bodies to stay young. But you're supposed to pick a socially acceptable body that has a number. And this girl had a father that died mysteriously. And so she's with her mother, and the whole world is, I think it's portrayed out of 3 other actors and this one woman who's different, who looks like kind of a young Sissy Spacek kind of girl. But she is sort of, she has a girlfriend that picked one of the numbers, and she's talking about, well, why do we have to change? Why do we have to pick a body? Why can't I just stay who I am? They'll say, well, don't you want to be beautiful? Don't you want to be amazing looking? She's like, yeah, but what if I like the way I look? And they said, well, you silly, that's not the way it works. And when you look at the way that we are taught how to look, what's acceptable, what's not acceptable, the fact that everyone gets in these trends where men literally industrially grow handlebar mustaches because that's what hipsters do, it's not that some guys don't look fantastic with that stuff, but the whole beard phenomenon that's going on right now, that, it's like cut and paste societies. It's like the joke I told the other day with the guy's in the parking lot. He's talking on his phone trying to tell his friend where to find him. And I just made a joke to this friend of mine I was with. And I said, yeah, I'm the guy that looks like everybody else. I mean, me with long hair, you can pitch me into any category you want. But it's just important that whoever you are is who you choose. But by the time this episode ends, you start to see how they psychologically pressure her into being someone else. And there's a twist at the end, which I guess I won't spoil for you, but really pay attention to the last 5 minutes of this episode. Pay attention to what she says before she encounters any change and after she encounters change. It's profound the way we live our lives today. So that is sort of a brief of the Twilight Zone and a bunch of the episodes that I love. And I think that it will, one, it's just fantastic entertainment. Out of all the episodes I skipped, the only episode of the entire series that I don't really get was called The Gift. And the odd thing is that Rod introduced The Gift as one of his favorite episodes that was ever made on the show, which it's just so weird. It's like Stanley Kubrick's Eyes Wide Shut. Could never understand that film. I mean, I think it was his worst film. It did leak out the fact that these people are having weird rituals and stuff. But all the other episodes, I think, are pretty phenomenal. In Season 4, if you happen to buy Season 4, get it. The only thing I will say is, outside of the few ultra-brilliant episodes within Season 4, there is something we call in Hollywood the stretch. And that is something where they don't really have intelligent story to take up time on camera. So they'll create huge, lengthy things. Like the latest Star Trek film, Star Trek 3, the movie, it was all a huge stretch. Barely any story, barely any character development, nothing you cared about, and it was just a motorcycle scene for 10 minutes, a chase around scene for 10 minutes. You don't care ever what's going on, because you know that everyone in the crew is going to survive. You just do. So you don't care. So in 4, instead of cutting perhaps a guy getting in the car really quickly, they will film the whole event of coming out the door, going around the car, opening the door, sitting in the seat, turning on the car, driving away. So there's a lot of stretch in Season 4. But the rest of the seasons, 1, 2, 3, and 5, are as tight as it can get. And I really think that, unlike Star Trek, the very first series in the 60s, where in 69 Gene Roddenberry bailed in between the Season 2 and 3 because he couldn't stand the way they were writing it, Twilight Zone really doesn't lose any quality in the 5th season. But the 4th definitely got out of their pocket, of their comfort zone. And they made the right decision going back to the half-hour/22-minute format. But this series will absolutely help you as a writer. It will help you as a human being. There are tremendous lessons to be learned in many of the episodes, at least I would say a good 40% of them, have the stuff that we really need to remember about ourselves. So I've been wanting to do this episode for a very long time. Wasn't quite sure how to do it. I don't usually use any assistance in making an episode because it really slows everything down. But Twilight Zone's worth the extra edit. So for those of you who are geeks and just love to know this kind of stuff, this episode's at 1 hour and 50 minutes right now. So if it's anything shorter than that, that's how much dead time it took me to look around this book, especially when it's dark. So hope you dug that. I won't make too many of these, but we did one on Stranger Things, so I figured we might want to put one in. I'm going to go ahead and give this one an episode number because I think it's worth it. So hope you feel me. If you dig the series, please subscribe. Know it's a variety show. If you like this episode, please give me a thumbs up. Take care of yourself and someone else, and I will see you in the next Deep Thoughts. Over now.